Mladen Jovanovic from Complementary Training here, and today I'm going to talk about agile planning in sport training, or present some idea that's been boiling in my head for some time, mostly by reading stuff on software development in IT industry and the problems they deal with uncertainty. And in my opinion, it has a lot to offer to sports training in general, and planning the season and everything that goes with it. And as you'll see, we probably already do it. Nothing new under the sun. I'm not trying to sell anything. Maybe I'm gonna put a trademark on Agile Periodization or things like that. But anyway, pretty much nothing new. I'm just gonna use the concept of managing the uncertainty as an additional factor that we need to put into account when we plan training. And in my opinion, as I always alluded in a couple of articles before, with planning we need to take a couple of things into account. One is, of course, the goals of training. Then we have the athlete characteristics, and then we have a context or constraints, as I would love to call them. And I will say the agile periodization, quotation mark, probably put more emphasis on constraints and context. Anyway, what's the sources of uncertainty and risk in training? Mostly competition calendar and opponents. Again, this agile periodization I think it's more applied to team sports, where we have much longer season compared to a preseason. But as we can see with individual sports as well, the season is getting longer and longer. The number of peaks that we need to maintain and reach during the yearly cycle or macro cycle is getting bigger and bigger. And this, I would say, separation between preseason and in-season or preparatory period and competition period is kind of blurring, especially in team sports. But also in individual sports as well. So we have a competition calendar that might change. We might get kicked out of a competition. We might drop in another one. So we might have A and B plans. The opponents might change. They, for example, in boxing and things like that, they might cancel. I'll give you one personal example from boxing. A year ago or a year and a half ago, I had a boxer coming to the gym, and he wanted to do some preparation for a competition. So I spoke with his father, who was his manager, and they said, okay, we're gonna have a fight in 3 weeks. And then I approach training in a different way, basically not trying to screw him up. And then a week inside the training, they say, okay, no, there's no fight, so we can just continue with something else. Okay, then I changed the plan. And then 3 weeks inside the training, he goes and say that we've been training too hard in the gym, and he doesn't have any energy for technical sessions. And I said that's pretty normal to begin with. He needs to adapt, and this is a period where we can actually emphasize this, the physical side of things. Because there's no fight scheduled, and once we have the fight scheduled, we can switch to pre-fight preparation, or as Joel Jameson likes to call it, 8 weeks out or 6 weeks out, whatever it takes for a fighter to prepare for a fight. But anyway, then they go again saying, okay, we have a next fight in 2 weeks. So again, the point is, this was highly uncertain, and the tool I used to solve this issue was inappropriate. So I wanted to create a block training, and that was completely inappropriate, taking into account the context and constraints. In this case, the uncertainty with competitions. And this also comes back to job security. For example, in team sports, especially in Serbia, in soccer, sometimes head coaches switch, are being, let go in 6 weeks or 6 months. It doesn't matter. So you never know when you're gonna get kicked out from the club. and that's real life. So the coaches needs to, deliver something that's called minimum viable product. This is from Lean Startup, I think. So we need to basically similar to short-term planning, but not just short-term planning, and we avoid all long-term development. But and also it's not long-term development without taking into account the product that we need to have as soon as possible. In this case, the performance. And again, this comes from IT industry, but I guess it has a lot to offer with training. So my minimum viable product is a pretty much stable performance of the squad. And anyone that been working with the team sports, for example, soccer or football, might come to a conclusion that, for example, the friendly games are not friendly. So and some of the coaches been kicked out from the club because of the bad performance during the friendly games. And we usually take friendlies as a preparatory games. It's not testing, but again it is, because the management wants the product immediately. So things like this needs to be taken into account when planning training. We cannot just plan for long cycles. Use for example, a Verkhoshansky model where when you have a concentrated block, you have a drop in performance, and then you have delayed realization of, and you have a peak. That's really problematic, because in that period the performance will suffer, and we don't have a minimum viable product to show to the fans, to show to the management, and we risk the job security. It's it's real life. Then we also have biological variation. People react differently to training. People have different life stresses, and I don't know any other better source than John Keely's recent articles and interviews at Martin Bigginser website. Then we have weather. We have finance. We might get budget cut. We also have, again, too much information. We might be paralyzed. We don't know where do we start? What do we do? Again, comes back to over planning. Investing too much time in planning, getting paralyzed, not knowing what to do. And to be honest, I suffer from that as well. And this MVP, as it's called, the minimum viable product, helps here. So we go back to the basics. We get the minimum viable product, and we slowly build up the plan. So the plan is, we don't plan in a big chunk. We start slowly. So it's emphasis on action. Then we also have mental biases. We are too confident in our planning. We are too confident in our plan, and we overplan. Then we have problems with the injuries in team sports. The player might drop out due to injury, and how do we reintroduce him to the training? How is he missing out, affecting the squad, and much more. So this is similar to traditionally we use this waterfall planning, and this is from project management. These phases are again from project management, but as you can see, it's pretty much similar to planning a performance or planning a yearly cycle. So we create needs analysis. We test the athletes to get the athlete characteristics. We create a training plan or the objectives. Then we proceed with the implementation, and then we test again. This is pretty much how we do it. And the thing with waterfall is that these phases are separated, and that creates a problem, as we're going to see later. So the problems with waterfall, Eisenhower said it the best. So the plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So it means that all the plans needs to be battle tested, and all the plans fail once they meet the reality. It was in lean management is called going to Gemba, if I remember correctly, or as I like to call it, when the rubber meets the road. So, but it's still the planning as a process is indispensable. And the problems with waterfall is that, as I said, we have the highest uncertainty at the beginning of the project. So we don't know how the thing's going to evolve, and we still overplan. So we create some fancy charts and like 6 weeks or not 6 months training plan and things like that, but we still don't have enough of information to modify the plan or be that much predictive inside the future, to the future. We also create a false sense of security with the plan, and we also don't know we don't know the unknowns problems, and we don't know the solutions. So it's called unknown unknowns, or unknown problems, and we don't know what are the solutions. So waterfall is tricky in this regard. Again, it's useful in certain fields where the certainty and stability is more predictable. And I'm not saying the waterfall should be kicked out completely. I'm just saying that it has issues with uncertainty, and it's not enough. And the question is the sport such a field? Is the sport a predictable field? I don't think so, especially if you take into account the uncertainties I mentioned before. The solution in IT industry is usually the iterative approaches to planning. So, as we said with the waterfall method, we don't separate the stages that much, and then we cycle quickly and frequently through all these waterfall stages instead of planning them in huge chunks. It's called usually the lean and agile approaches. There's a difference between them, but I'm not that familiar with the concept. Lean is coming from Toyota industry, where they optimize the production line. It's quite useful. We'll come back to it. And agile is mostly iterative approaches to planning. One of the most famous agile implementation is called Scrum, and there's a book, and actually that book started this whole topic. We also, I alluded to MVP, or most viable product. This is a product we deliver. It's good enough. So as some people will say, perfect is the enemy of the good enough. And I think with too much information we have these days, we might become paralyzed, and we need to have something that's workable, that we can start with, and then we upgrade as we go, instead of trying to create a perfect product from the start, and that's just ridiculous. And again, as I said, we need to avoid over planning, since we don't have the information at the start. The information we're gonna gather as we go inside the season, once we meet the players, the players' lifestyles and all that stuff. And similar to MVP, we need to be action based. We cannot wait for the research to tell us should we do this or that. We need to deal with uncertainty. And it's mostly process. It's process oriented as opposed to plan oriented. And with this embedded approach, for example, testing is not being done in a chunk or in a phase. So testing is ongoing, especially with the GPS technology, things like that. So we don't need to. I would say not as of now, but in the near future, we don't need testing as a phase. So we don't need to lose time on testing. We can do it ongoing. So testing is training, and training is testing, to use Warren Gabetta's quote. For example, if we keep track of velocity-based lifts in the gym, we can estimate 1 RMs. We don't need to test them, and we have this information more frequently than with testing, and without burdening the squad, or even mentally or time and energy wise. With GPS, we might come with some ideas from cycling, where we can create the rolling averages, and then we can estimate the something that's called velocity duration curves, and we can use that to judge the different training cycles or changes in athlete characteristics, such as maximum aerobic speed and things like that. And with these iterative approaches, we take uncertainty into account. So we don't know so we are not aware what's being not aware, or it's a lot of unknowns, and with iterative approaches we take that into account. So when we get hit in the head, we have a solution to deal with it. These are just some nice charts you can find on the Google, showing the difference between waterfall. As you can see, it's quite similar to sequential planning compared to a parallel or complex parallel. And as I said, nothing new under the sun. So this is pretty much it. It's the difference between sequential and complex or parallel planning. And as we can see, with the waterfall, the risk of a project failing is getting higher and higher as we go inside. So we might say, okay, our blocks were not really good assembled and some athletes didn't react and things like that. So the risk of failure is increasing. With the agile approach, we have these iterative approaches, and then the risk is being controlled. This is similar, same picture. So again, we have these iterations, we have phases, but we have iterations inside the phases. And again, similar picture showing the product and chance of failure and project run rate. So with the waterfall, the chance of failure is increasing. We don't have the product in the beginning, so again, this might risk us the job, and especially with the friendly games and short preparatory periods. And it's getting, to fix things down the road is getting more costlier and costlier. So compared to the agile approach. And this comes back also to anti-fragile concept by Nassim Taleb. So anti-fragility is avoiding the downside and getting the upside. For example, in this case, from some unpredictable events, we don't get much downside or problems. In this case, might be injuries, might be bad performance, but we can get huge gain from potential random events. And this is fragile approach. So we don't get much gain here, and we get huge pain. So it's in this case, I would say this is also similar to via negativa approach, where we avoid, we try to succeed, but by avoiding to suck. So in team sports is keeping your best players on the pitch through the season. That's the goal number one. So they are available to play. Any gains, the potential gains are there, but the thing is we are defending from the pain. And I think this is one interesting concept with managing uncertainty and risk, and it needs to be taken inside the planning. And as I said, there's numerous applications to sports planning, and nothing new under the sun, just different way to look at things. Waterfall is still needed, but not enough, as I said before. And this is pretty much similar to vertical integration by Charlie Francis. Again, complex approach. Everything is done, only the volume varies. Similar to Tshien model. I don't even know how to pronounce his name. He's a German scientist. His model was opposed to Matvey model and has more stable volume and intensity across the season with some waves. If you Google it, you can find the image. It's quite easy. Then we also have tactical periodization ideas, which is also, in my opinion, an iterative approach. You also have Raymond Verheyen approach, I'm gonna mention later. And Stuart McMillan recently alluded to this concept of micro dictates macro, and that's pretty much it. He designed 3-week cycles. And depending on the reaction of the training, those macro cycles dictate the macro. So that's pretty much the iterative approach. And as I said, the embedded testing and planning, the testing should be done ongoing. So if the testing is done ongoing, it's called monitoring. So with the novel technology, we can actually do that easier, and so we don't need to design that special testing phases, and they could be embedded inside the training. Same thing with planning. It shouldn't be done in cycles. It should be ongoing. And as Stuart McMillan alluded, it's called process-based as opposed to plan-based. We also need to create, in my opinion, stability with the training. and we also need to provide some variability, and I like to call that variability without variability, because if the training is same all the time, it's going to be monotonous, and it's going to be boring. Also, Bondarchuk have similar approach, in my opinion. Please, someone correct me if I'm wrong here. So the cycles are stable, the training is stable across time, and he adjusts on the go. So he just throws everything, basically doing all the categories inside one training session and across the week, and he adjusts based on the reaction of the athlete. So in my opinion, that's a iterative approach with the embedded planning and embedded testing. As I said earlier in the beginning, training blocks are more similar than different, and in this case that's the difference between in-season and pre-season. In my opinion, they shouldn't be that much different, especially in team sports, but again, depends on your specific situation and specific scenario. It's also easier to reintroduce injured players. So if we have training phases and the player is basically kicked out of the training due to the injury, it's harder to put him back inside the training because he missed the phases. But if things happen quickly and they reiterate and they take this potential risk into the consideration, that's a quite big risk and pretty unavoidable in team sports. It's easier to reintroduce the injured players inside the training or in return to play protocols. And it's also easier to coordinate between starting players and reserves, because it comes back to the similar issues with reintroducing the injured players, because the starting players might stop playing and they need to be reintroduced to training. The training load needs to be increased for them and things like that. And if we have more quicker phases, we have iterative approach. This is a lot easier to be done. So some of the solutions, I would say they are agile, are Dunn-Baker wave. This is similar to Jim Wandler 531. We have those 3-week cycles that been rotated. Daily undulating periodization is similar approach. Interesting thing is that Dan Pfaff 3-day rollover plan, where he actually prescribed 3 sessions: is acceleration, max speed, and speed endurance, if I remember correctly. So these are the main things that needs to be done, and depending on the reaction of the athlete or the situation, the hotel, travel, things like that the uncertainty, it's easier to implement these 3 days, and that's the key stuff that needs to be done. And the uncertainty is being taken into account to avoid over planning. So he just goes with the flow, but all those 3 important concepts are being done continuously. As I say, Charlie Francis approach, John Keeley wrote about this, Raymond Verheyen used similar approach, as you can see on the table. So he split the I will call it special conditioning, but it's game conditioning using small-sided games and medium-sided games and big-sided games, and he cycles them throughout the preseason and throughout the in-season. With the preseason, he have 2-week plans. With in-season, the frequency is one week. One interesting thing is to prepare for a main load. For example, in this case, in week 1 and 2, the main emphasis is big games, but he also introduced the medium games because in the next 2 weeks they're gonna be main emphasis. So he kind of prepare the athletes for the main load when the main load hits them hard. It's pretty similar to in the gym work. For example, in season, if we tend to rotate the exercises, it might be wise to introduce the exercise before we hit it hard, or hit it hard with the main volume. So for example, if you're doing back squats and you want to do front squats for a next cycle, you might introduce some front squats in the preceding weeks. This might be a warm-up set for a back squat and things like that. So we avoid the downside, as I alluded with the Nassim Taleb. And in this case, downside could be soreness, could be fatigue-related syndromes and things like that. And because if the players are sore, their legs are, dead, you risk your job. And again, this is uncertainty we need to take into account when we plan training. And again, this is a complex parallel approach. And I don't want to sell anything, but in my opinion, the Agile Periodization is a interesting term. As we can see, this is a traditional approach. Usually, you can find it in Bompa's books, where we have preparatory, and sorry, this is competition period. This is my error, and transition. And he usually splits it in GPP, SPP, and then we have phases. In this case, this is only strength training component of the training plan. So we have hypertrophy, maximum strength, power, and in this case, strength endurance, or again, depends on the sport. And then we have huge maintenance periods. And my question is like, what's being done here? This is just a huge black area where we black box. We don't know what's being done here. And we have transition when we usually do anatomic adaptation. With the block training, block periodization concept by Vladimir Surin, he's quite more similar to the Agile approach, where he cycles through 3 blocks. Again, depends on the duration of the competition and frequency of the competition. So usually in accumulation, he hits the aerobic endurance, maximum strength, things like that. In transition, it's usually the glycolytic endurance or anaerobic endurance, strength endurance, things like that. And realization cycle is usually lactic capacities and just general taper. And we can just cycle these through a competition period. There are a couple of papers being done showing that this approach is being used in soccer. You have it in the new book by Surin, the Building the Modern Athlete, which is just being published. So you can check that this approach is actually being used inside the team sports, where we have the long competition period. With the Agile approach, it's basically complex or parallel approach where we train everything. We still can have the phases, but in every phase we do everything. We just might switch the emphasis a little bit. And as you can see in the hypertrophy cycle, we still do everything, but we emphasize the hypertrophy workout. This is quite similar to daily undulating periodization or daily undulating planning. And you can listen more about it in the upcoming podcast or interview with Mike Zurdos, and we spent 3.5 hours talking about this stuff. So in this case, we can. This is I will say variation without variation. We still have variation, by switching blocks, but the blocks are more similar than different. In this case, we have a minimum viable product. In this case, if something happens here, so the competition is moved, we can easily prepare for the change, as opposed to, for example, with the Bompa. The uncertainty is not being taken into account. If the competition moves, slides, and this can happen also in powerlifting, competition could be cancelled, could be delayed, could be moved maybe a couple of weeks in advance. With this approach, we take this uncertainty into account, and we can easily switch, because we are not that far from every training cycle. The problem with the complex approach or parallel approach is that the volume might be higher compared to this one, and one of the reasons why block periodization emerged is to reduce the volume of the complex approaches, because everything is being done here, and then we have some sequence here. We still do a couple of things here, couple of things here, couple of things here, but they are not being done together at the same time. And with the complex approach, we have this issue with the high volume and also mixed signals, and the good planning, especially the macro planning and implementation of recovery strategies, is quite important in the agile or complex approach. Again, it's a trade-off between managing the uncertainty and managing the training workloads. Again, everything is kind of interdependent. So as you can see, with the agile, everything's being done. We just slightly switch the emphasis, and the similarity between the big blocks with the preparatory period and a competition period is quite similar. So in this case, the turnaround could be shorter, could be 1 or 2 weeks, and in this case we can create more saturation, to use Nick Winkelmann's term. We can use more saturation for a given quality and make these blocks a little bit longer, but also don't neglect the other stuff to come. Again, nothing new under the sun, it's just a easy way to depict things. One interesting thing from the lean approaches is this standardized workout or standardization, and it's easier to see it here. The standard work is something that gives us the stability, and then we can experiment with something that's called I forgot the right sequence. I think it's a plan, do, check, act cycle. It comes from a lean management. So we can use standard things that keep us stable across time. We are just not throwing baby with the bathwater. So we need a standard workout. Not standard workout, but standard planning things. That's something that's being time tested and seems to be working, and then we can experiment with it with the plan, do, check, act cycle. This is just like experimentation, and we can always come back to our safety using a standard work. So standardized work is basically principle or philosophy based. So this is our standardized things, and once we have this stable thing, we can experiment more with the plan, do, act, check cycle, which is experiment. In this case, standardized work is the principles behind training. So we even if we experiment with things, we still need to have sound principles in check. One useful thing is to use checklists. For example, we need to make sure that certain things are not being forgotten, not being I will say not are being taken care of, and then we can experiment around those things. This is a great book to read, Checklist Manifesto. I highly recommend it. One also thing we can also put as a checklist is a communication. Once we stumble on uncertainty or something that we don't know how to deal with, we need to make sure to communicate with other experts, and that's also one checkbox on a checklist. So we need to make standardized work where we communicate with the SNC, with the head coach, with the medical squad, and all that things. Once we have this in check, then we can play with different experiments. I would say different approaches, different experiments, and that's why we have this iterative approach, where the experiments is not something that's long, but something that's shorter and more controllable. One way to look at things also is a standardized work is a team practices, and as a strength conditioning coaches, we need to complement this with physical preparation stuff. So if the practices are hard, plenty of practices, plenty of running, plenty of contact, we need to take care of that in our planning and modify our approaches in those high load weeks. So maybe completely get off the legs with the conditioning in physical preparation side of things, maybe do bike intervals, things like that, just to unload the legs. Again, this comes back to a planning embedded testing. We have the information immediately, we visualize the information. The visualization is quite important with the lean and Kanban approaches to planning. Once we visualize things, in this case the training loads, we can easily adjust other things that needs to be adjusted. And again, this is variation without variation. We still want to have a stable volume and stable intensity across the in-season and pre-season. I would say quasi-stable, because we also have these small waves around this stable pattern. And I'll just go through some examples in strength training. I will say the agile approach could be daily undulating periodization or planning. You can find out more about the difference with Mike Zurdo's interview that's upcoming. We avoid the downside, soreness, especially when we switch blocks. And again, increase job security, because we don't want athletes to be sore in season. We also maintain volume intensity. There's no abrupt jumps, and all the abrupt jumps can cause fatigue-related syndromes. But we also need to make things more variable, because it gets boring if you do things all the time the same. In this case, we might rotate the exercises just to make things a little bit more interesting, and we create different stimuli. But this stimuli can cause soreness, so we need to introduce the exercises earlier, as I alluded in Verheyen approach with specific conditioning using a small-sided games. So in this case, we have a day 1 and day 2. I use the wave approach. So this is example 1, example 2. So we hit, in this case, lower reps. And in day 2 we also hit higher reps, but we have some overlap between them, because if these are too wide, too far away, we might cause soreness because we switch the reps too quickly. To avoid the soreness, I have some, I will call it a spread within the workout. So we are, and this is also, I would say, more interesting to be done than sets across, but we also avoid the uncertainty of getting sore. Pretty much same here. We have one top set, and then we have the back off sets where we can hit and we can gain the volume. So day 1 is more intensive when it comes to percentage of 1 RM, so lower reps, and day 2 could be higher reps. And the progression across weeks this is similar to Dan Baker approach. So again, this is day 1, day 2. So day 1 can progress downward, and day 2 can progress upward. So once we switch, when we paste week 1, week 2, week 3, and then we paste week 1 again here, the change is not that abrupt, and the volume, total weekly volume, is quite similar across the weeks. So there's no abrupt changes, and so we avoid the downside. And comes back to a via negativa approach, where we avoid the soreness, and we gain the potential benefits, and hence the approach is anti-fragile, I guess, at least in theory. I'm not trying to sell anything anti-fragile periodization and things like that. I'm just trying to take into account the uncertainty, avoid the boredom, and create job security. With the conditioning, it could be, again, providing some types of balance and smooth transition between phases. And this could be also combining hard easy. So week 1 could be doing higher intensity strides with a longer rest. Then we can do aerobic power with a long cycles. I guess this is around 2 to 4 minutes intervals. With week 2 we can do, again, higher intensity repeat sprints. This is quite tough because this session is quite tough. This needs to be easier, so we have extensive intervals. This could be lower intensity intervals, for example 2 to 1, 2 minutes run, 1 minute easy. And in this case we have anaerobic power. This could be 15 to 30 seconds all out intervals. And then we have aerobic power that again could be long, or because this is shorter, this needs to be longer. Again, I don't have the right solution. That's the point. With the agile approach, I think there's a simple solution, but it's not known in advance. So I need to start with something, get the minimum viable product. I still stress the both systems. I get the minimum viable product, but I see how the people react to this. I create some type of variability without actually creating variability. So I'm still hitting those qualities slightly different, without creating fatigue-related syndromes, without abrupt changes, but I still create some variations. So this is an iterative approach, and then I can, juggle with uncertainty in terms of how are the athletes reacting to this, and do they like it? Are they sore after this, and things like that. Again, it comes back to with the agile approach to periodization, it comes back to juggling the uncertainty that most waterfall plans doesn't take into account. With the tactical skills, I alluded to Verheyen approach, and this is a tactical periodization approach where we can see the standardization across the weeks. So the week is pretty much same across, and then we have some small variations across the month or across the year. Again, this is, in my opinion, iterative approach because it's a short cycle, it's repeated, and it's complex. So we do the things all the time the same. We create some variation within this weekly pattern. So it's quite useful to read. There are a couple of free articles online. Just Google tactical periodization. So in this case, it's just with tactical periodization, they are the qualities that are being hit are tactical qualities or game phases, instead of biomotor qualities that are usually being the main emphasis of planning with the traditional approaches such as Bompas and even Isurin approach. The tactical approach is still concerned with biomotor, but the main emphasis are team tactics and the components of team tactic and hence team success. Where you can find more, these are some of the books I read and some books I'm still reading. As you can see, none of them is training related book. I'm pretty much certain that we, as strength conditioning coaches, we need to read more about other fields, especially business, because they already solved some of the problems we are struggling with. The great start is this book, the Scrum book, and then you can just pick and choose from these couple. Some of them are more about productivity, the individual productivity, but again, you can pretty much find some parallels with planning and training organization in sport performance. Thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. Give me a shout out or shoot out on the blog or the forum or Facebook. I recently opened the Facebook page, complementary training. So just shoot me with some questions. I don't have the answers to everything. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this concept of uncertainty, and this has been boiling and bothering me for some time, and hopefully this created some type of a structure we can use and we can discuss and learn from and learn from each other. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.